Hi viewers, in this video I will show you how I removed, fixed and refitted the ignition lock cylinder on my 1993 Honda Civic del Sol.
After years of use, the Honda vehicles from the 90s and the early 2000s can have some problems with their ignition lock cylinder. The basic problems are caused by worn out tumblers inside the lock cylinder and worn out ignition key blades. Not long ago I was gone for a short weekend trip and I had a lot of problems turning the key to start the engine. After many trials, I was able to start the engine, but I did come close to call a locksmith. Once back home, I parked my car in my garage, ready to be fixed. The next morning, I disconnected the battery to avoid any electrical problem or airbag deployment during the removal of the ignition lock cylinder. The first parts I removed to gain access to the lock cylinder were the lower and the upper steering column covers. The parts were held on the steering column by 3 Phillips head screws and some clips. Here you can see the ignition lock cylinder inserted in the steering lock assembly. I drew a dotted line to show you the locking pin alignment with the ignition key turned to position 1. Because I prefer to work with ergonomic tools, I made those two ones: a custom pick tool for the locking pin and a small hook for the inner lock mechanism. First, the key was properly aligned, then I used the pick tool to depress the locking pin and partially unlock the lock cylinder. Next, I used the key to pull out the lock cylinder from the steering lock assembly. Finally, I utilized my custom hook to pull out and disengage the inner locking mechanism, then fully remove the lock cylinder. My lock cylinder assembly was made in Japan, and it was not engineered to be replaced by the American version. Here, you can see some differences between versions. Nevertheless, Honda has used this type of tumblers inside different versions of cylinders for many years. This is why I decided to check if I could find some good usable tumblers in a used lock cylinder I had in stock. Lock cylinder caps can be tricky to remove, but I was patient enough to undo them. After, I removed the snap ring securing the lock cylinder on each assembly. Then I pulled out the cylinder from my Japanese part and I tested if the tumblers were moving properly. After the second inspection, I noticed that 3 tumblers were a bit out of the cylinder when the key was inserted. To properly inspect all the tumblers, I removed all of them and I took note of their specific location and their ID number. Each tumbler is stamped with a specific number from 1 to 6. Luckily, I've been able to find 3 tumblers in good condition to replace the worn-out ones. I made sure all the small springs were still in place, then I inserted each numbered tumbler in its allocated slot, so I was able to keep the original key cut with the ignition lock cylinder. Before refitting the cylinder, I used a small metal file to soften a damaged surface inside the lock cylinder housing. As I said, the other problems with the tumbler adjustments were caused by some worn-out cuts on the blade of the original key. My simple solution was to use a known good copy of the key that was made many years ago. When the cylinder was inserted in the cavity, I tested if it was moving properly, and it was fine. Next, I put back the snap ring and I tried it again. To complete the assembly, I pressed and secured the lock cylinder cap in place. I also had another spare key made to test the assembly before installing it. Back in the car, I refitted the lock cylinder in place. I used my custom hook to pull out the inner locking mechanism. Then, when the mechanism was released and engaged, I fully inserted the lock cylinder in the steering column lock assembly. During the installation, I held the lock cylinder with the key while keeping it to the position 1. I retested the 2 keys and the cylinder was functioning properly. I removed the key, then I reconnected the battery. I started the engine and everything worked fine. After the road test, I refitted the upper and the lower steering column covers. I could have ordered an aftermarket lock cylinder or a tumbler kit, but I was lucky to be able to use my spare parts.
Just in case you cannot remove the lock cylinder from the steering lock assembly, it's a good option to contact a locksmith that knows the Honda products in order to solve the problem rapidly.